1929. Winston Churchill, not yet Prime Minister, but already famous, toured the United States for 3 months. He traveled from New York to California. He met business leaders, politicians, ordinary Americans. He observed American culture, politics, and society with the keen eye of a historian and politician. What he wrote and said privately about America during that trip was remarkably candid. He praised American innovation and resilience, but he also criticized what he saw as dangerous short-sightedness in American policy and culture. Some of his observations were eerily prescient, predicting problems that would emerge decades later. Others revealed biases and blind spots that Churchill himself would later outgrow. But what's most striking is how relevant his 1929 observations remain today. The tensions he identified between isolationism and global engagement, between optimism and naivete, between innovation and instability, are still debated in American politics nearly a century later. This is what Churchill really thought about America before World War II made them allies, and why his early impressions still matter. If you want to see what one of history's greatest leaders thought about America, hit subscribe right now. To understand Churchill's 1929 observations, you need to understand why he was in America in the first place. Churchill, in 1929, was not the Churchill of World War II. He wasn't Prime Minister. He wasn't leading Britain through its darkest hour. He was a conservative politician who'd served in various government positions, but was currently out of power and somewhat politically isolated. He was also financially struggling. Churchill lived expensively. He maintained multiple properties, employed large staff, and lived beyond his means. He needed money, and one reliable source of income for prominent British figures was American lecture tours. American audiences in the 1920s were fascinated by British politicians, especially ones as colorful and articulate as Churchill. He could command substantial fees for speeches and appearances. So, in 1929, Churchill embarked on a 3-month tour of the United States. He gave lectures, met with business leaders, visited cities, and observed American life during what seemed like a golden age, the height of the roaring 20s, just months before the stock market crash. But Churchill wasn't just there to make money. He was genuinely curious about America. He saw it as the rising power of the 20th century, a nation that would inevitably shape global affairs. He wanted to understand Americans, their culture, their politics, their worldview. He approached America with a mixture of admiration and skepticism. Admiration for American energy, innovation, and prosperity, skepticism about American political judgment, cultural depth, and understanding of international affairs. Churchill kept detailed notes during his trip. He wrote letters to friends and family describing what he saw. He gave private speeches that were more candid than his public addresses, and these private observations reveal what he really thought. Churchill's observations about America weren't entirely critical. In fact, he was genuinely impressed by several aspects of American society. Innovation and energy. Churchill was amazed by American technological advancement and dynamism. He toured factories, saw modern infrastructure, observed how quickly Americans adopted new technologies. He wrote, "The Americans possess a genius for practical organization and mechanical innovation that surpasses anything in Europe." This wasn't empty flattery. Churchill genuinely believed Americans had a special talent for turning ideas into reality, for solving practical problems through innovation rather than tradition. Optimism and confidence. Churchill noted that Americans had a fundamentally different outlook than Europeans. Where Europeans saw limits and constraints, Americans saw possibilities and opportunities. He wrote, "Americans believe problems exist to be solved, not endured. This is both their greatest strength and potentially their greatest vulnerability." That qualification, potentially their greatest vulnerability, was typical Churchill. Even his praise came with reservations. Economic prosperity. 1929 America was extraordinarily wealthy compared to most of the world. Churchill was impressed by the standard of living, the widespread ownership of cars and modern appliances, the general prosperity. He noted that even ordinary Americans lived better than middle-class Europeans. But he also worried this prosperity was built on unstable foundations, a concern that proved prescient when the Great Depression hit just months after his visit. Democratic spirit. Churchill appreciated American informality and egalitarianism. He noted that American society lacked the rigid class structures of Britain. A factory worker could become a business owner. Social mobility seemed genuinely possible in ways it wasn't in Europe. He wrote, "In America, a man's background matters less than his ability and determination. This democratic spirit is admirable, even if it sometimes produces leaders of questionable judgment." Again, note the qualification. Churchill could never give unqualified praise. Resilience. Churchill observed that Americans had a remarkable ability to recover from setbacks. He saw this as cultural. Americans didn't dwell on failures, they moved forward. This resilience, he believed, would make America a formidable power in any future crisis. This observation would prove crucial during World War II, when Churchill needed to convince Americans to join the fight against Hitler. But Churchill's private observations also included sharp criticisms of American society and politics. Isolationism and naivete. This was Churchill's most significant concern. He believed Americans were dangerously naive about international affairs. They thought they could avoid global conflicts by simply staying out of them. Churchill wrote, "Americans seem to believe the Atlantic Ocean is a moat that protects them from European problems. They fail to understand that in the modern world, no nation can truly isolate itself from global affairs." This wasn't just observation, it was warning. Churchill believed American isolationism was dangerous both for America and for the world order. He thought Americans would eventually be forced to engage internationally, but their reluctance to do so early would make inevitable conflicts worse. Short-term thinking. Churchill criticized what he saw as American focus on immediate results rather than long-term consequences. He observed that American businesses prioritized quarterly profits over sustainable growth. American politicians focused on next election rather than next generation. He noted, "Americans excel at solving immediate problems, but often fail to anticipate future consequences of today's decisions. This short-sightedness may prove costly." This observation was remarkably prescient. Churchill was essentially describing what modern economists call short-termism, a problem that continues to plague American business and politics. Prohibition. Churchill was baffled and appalled by American prohibition. As someone who enjoyed alcohol and saw it as part of civilized life, he couldn't understand why Americans had banned it. But his criticism went deeper than personal preference. He saw prohibition as an example of American tendency toward moralistic overreach, trying to legislate behavior rather than accepting human nature. He wrote, "The Americans' attempt to prohibit alcohol through constitutional amendment reveals a naive belief that laws can perfect human nature. This experiment will fail, and the failure will teach them a valuable lesson about the limits of legislation." He was right. Prohibition was repealed in 1933. Cultural shallowness. This was Churchill's most elitist criticism. He felt American culture lacked the depth and tradition of European civilization. American entertainment was too commercial, American education too practical, American taste too populist. He wrote, "Americans value what works over what endures. They prefer the new to the traditional. This produces remarkable innovation, but also a certain cultural rootlessness." This criticism reveals Churchill's own biases. His definition of culture was very British and aristocratic. He didn't fully appreciate that American culture was developing differently, not necessarily shallowly. Political immaturity. Churchill was concerned about American political discourse. He thought American politicians pandered to public opinion too much. He worried that democratic populism could produce terrible leadership. He observed, "American democracy allows anyone to rise to leadership based on popularity rather than wisdom. This produces energetic government, but not always competent government." Coming from a British aristocrat who believed in rule by educated elites, this criticism isn't surprising, but it also reflects genuine concern about democratic systems' vulnerabilities. Churchill's American tour had dramatic personal consequences he never anticipated. In September 1929, Churchill visited Wall Street. He met with financiers, observed the stock market, and even invested some of his own money in American stocks. The market was booming. Everyone seemed to be getting rich. Churchill was impressed by American financial innovation, but also troubled by what he saw. He noticed that stocks were priced far beyond any reasonable valuation. He observed that ordinary people were borrowing money to invest in the market, betting that prices would continue rising forever. He wrote privately, "The American stock market seems to be built on optimism rather than fundamentals. This cannot continue indefinitely." But despite his reservations, Churchill didn't predict the crash was imminent, and he certainly didn't protect his own investments. On October 24, 1929, Black Thursday, the stock market crashed. Within weeks, Churchill's American investments were nearly worthless. He lost the equivalent of millions in today's money. The financial losses were devastating for Churchill personally. He was forced to sell his London home. He had to increase his writing and speaking to recover financially. The crash affected his personal finances for years. But the experience also validated some of his concerns about American capitalism. The boom and bust cycle, the speculative excess, the belief that markets would rise forever, all the problems he'd observed came crashing down. The Great Depression that followed transformed America and the world. The optimism Churchill had observed in 1929 gave way to desperation. American isolationism intensified as people focused on domestic economic crisis rather than international affairs. Churchill watched from Britain as America struggled through the Depression. His 1929 observations took on new meaning. The resilience he'd admired was tested. The short-term thinking he'd criticized contributed to the crisis. The democratic spirit he'd praised was challenged by economic suffering. When World War II began in 1939 and Churchill became Prime Minister in 1940, his 1929 observations of America proved crucial. Churchill knew Britain couldn't defeat Nazi Germany alone. He needed American support. First economic aid, eventually military involvement. But he also knew from 1929 that Americans were isolationist and reluctant to engage in European conflicts. His entire strategy for bringing America into the war was shaped by what he'd learned in 1929. Appeal to American idealism. Churchill knew Americans responded to moral arguments. He framed the war not as European power politics, but as a fight for democracy and freedom. He knew Americans would resist defending British imperial interests, but might fight for universal values. Emphasize shared danger. Churchill worked to overcome American belief that the Atlantic Ocean protected them. He emphasized that Nazi Germany threatened the entire world, not just Europe. He used his understanding of American psychology to make the threat feel immediate and personal. Build personal relationships. Churchill's 1929 tour had taught him the importance of personal connection in American culture. He cultivated a close relationship with President Roosevelt, writing him frequent personal letters, speaking to him directly, building trust through personal friendship rather than just diplomatic formality. Be patient with American politics. Churchill understood from 1929 that American democracy moved slowly, that public opinion mattered enormously, that Roosevelt simply couldn't declare war even if he wanted to. Churchill's patience wartime with American political processes reflected his 1929 understanding of how American government worked. Highlight American resilience. When trying to convince Americans to join the war, Churchill highlighted British resilience. Standing alone against Hitler was the kind of courage Americans admired. He presented Britain not as weak and needing rescue, but as resilient and worthy of American partnership. Address economic interests. Churchill knew from 1929 that Americans responded to practical arguments. He emphasized that British defeat would harm American economic interests, that fighting Hitler now was cheaper than fighting him later, that American prosperity required a stable international order. All of these strategies reflected Churchill's 1929 observations. He'd studied Americans for 3 months, and he used that knowledge to help win the war.
What makes Churchill's 1929 observations particularly interesting is how relevant they remain nearly a century later. Isolationism versus global engagement. The tension Churchill observed in 1929 between Americans who want to focus domestically and those who see international engagement as necessary remains central to American political debate. America first versus global leadership is the same argument Churchill witnessed in 1929. Short-term thinking. Churchill's criticism of American focus on immediate results rather than long-term consequences resonates today. Modern debates about infrastructure investment, climate policy, deficit spending all involve the same tension between short-term costs and long-term benefits that Churchill identified. Optimism and resilience. American belief that problems exist to be solved, that setbacks are temporary, that tomorrow will be better. This optimistic spirit Churchill admired in 1929 still characterizes American culture. For better or worse, Americans remain more optimistic than most other developed nations. Innovation and disruption. Churchill's talent for innovation that impressed Churchill in 1929 continues today. Silicon Valley, technological advancement, business dynamism, these are modern versions of what Churchill observed in 1929, and his warning that this innovation can produce instability also remains relevant. Democratic populism. Churchill's concern about American democracy elevating popular but potentially incompetent leaders based on charisma rather than wisdom, this debate continues today. Every election cycle features arguments about whether voters choose wisely or whether democracy produces problematic leadership. Cultural confidence. The American confidence Churchill observed, the belief in American exceptionalism, the conviction that American values should guide the world, remains a defining characteristic. Whether this confidence is justified or arrogant depends on perspective, but it's undeniably persistent. Economic cycles. The boom and bust pattern Churchill witnessed in 1929, culminating in the stock market crash, has repeated multiple times since. The 2008 financial crisis, various market bubbles, American capitalism continues to display the speculative excess Churchill warned about. Churchill's 1929 observations weren't perfect predictions. He had blind spots and biases, but his core insights about what makes America powerful and what makes America problematic remain relevant today. It's important to acknowledge what Churchill got wrong or failed to understand in 1929. American culture. His criticism of American culture as shallow reflected elitist British assumptions. American culture wasn't shallow, it was different. It was creating new forms, jazz, Hollywood, modernist literature, that would eventually influence the entire world, including Britain. Democratic leadership. Churchill's skepticism about democratic populism producing competent leaders was partly aristocratic bias. American democracy produced Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, leaders who proved highly capable despite Churchill's concerns about the selection process. Isolationism as purely negative. Churchill saw American isolationism only as dangerous naivety. He didn't fully appreciate the reasonable arguments for it, that America had its own problems to solve, that European conflicts weren't always America's responsibility, that staying out of foreign wars saved American lives. Economic resilience. While Churchill admired American economic innovation, he underestimated American capitalism's ability to recover from the Depression. The New Deal and World War II mobilization proved that American system had more adaptive capacity than Churchill initially believed. American global role. Churchill wanted America to engage globally in 1929, but he imagined that engagement supporting British imperial interests. He didn't foresee that American global leadership would eventually eclipse British power and reshape the international order on American rather than British terms. Churchill learned from these mistakes. His later relationship with America showed more sophisticated understanding, but his 1929 observations, while insightful, were also limited by his perspective as a British aristocrat who couldn't fully understand American democracy and culture. 1929. Churchill touring America, 3 months of observation that shaped how he would later navigate the most important alliance of World War II. What he saw impressed him. Innovation, optimism, resilience, democratic spirit. These were the qualities that would make America essential to defeating Hitler. What concerned him also proved significant. Isolationism, short-term thinking, naivete about international affairs, democratic populism. These were the challenges he'd have to navigate to bring America into the war. His observations weren't perfect. He had blind spots and biases. He underestimated some American strengths and misunderstood some American values. But his core insights about what makes America powerful and what makes America problematic remain relevant today. The tensions Churchill identified in 1929 haven't been resolved. Americans still debate isolationism versus engagement, short-term thinking versus long-term planning, optimistic confidence versus realistic assessment, democratic populism versus competent leadership. These aren't new debates, they're the same debates Churchill observed nearly a century ago, and his observations, admiring American strengths while worrying about American weaknesses, still capture something essential about American character. Churchill came to America to make money and satisfy his curiosity. What he learned helped him save the world, and what he said about America in 1929 can still help us understand ourselves today. Which of Churchill's 1929 observations do you think is most relevant today? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you want more historical insights that illuminate the present, subscribe now. See you next time.